long and involved, and as I said, a little tasteless, but there you are. We're all human, aren't we? And then I guess I've been thinking about this week too. May my words pass through the gates of truth, kindness, and necessity. Those three gates. Now we know that in casual conversation, we don't want to become too complex or critical, or we don't want to add a level of complexity to our relationships. And a lot of times we are telling jokes, and it is funny, and we need to keep that up. But how many times, and I bet we've all been there, haven't we? Have we said something that hurt another? Have we said something that encouraged someone else? Maybe they did something, they lost their job. Maybe they got in trouble. Or as we've seen this past week, maybe they ended up in jail over it. Our words have power. We need to use them very, very carefully. Very carefully. Every tradition in the world has spoken of this. Everyone has a saying. All of the ancient traditions talked about, maybe not exactly this. These are the words of Rumi. May my words pass through the gates of truth, kindness, and necessity. And from Khalil Gibran, I have learned silence from the talkative. Think about that for a moment. Tolerance from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. I'm going to remind you of that again in a moment. So often we do talk in such a casual way that we will forget. I know one woman that I was reading about this past week, she said, I have forgotten, yet again, when will I learn? She said something to a friend that hurt her. And then later she found out that what she said was not helpful, it wasn't kind, and nor did it have truth within it. Because when she found out the truth of the situation, she found out that her friend had just gone through one of the most terrible weeks she'd ever had at work. And then she was acting on something she had heard and carelessly said something to her friend that hurt her. Our words are like a sword. So the woman went on to say that she apologized profusely to her friend, and she was given grace of forgiveness. And she appreciated that, and she hoped that she would remember to watch over her words in the future and keep them kind. Is there truth? Boy, we could write a book on this the past couple of years, couldn't we? Of how much words are spoken, and there's no truth in them. And the next thing you know, there's been all sorts of harm that's been done because of it. I think I told you this example before that when I was in the corporate world, and you know, you find that going through those gates is difficult sometimes, and you will find many times that you need to speak a truth, and it is necessary. So you do find that. But you can also do it with kindness, integrity. So there was I remember a young woman, and I've told you about this before. She was sort of on the edge, anxiety-wise anyway, and her words were always sharp. So you knew that about her, so you just sort of left her alone. She was in the accounting department. And she had been on vacation for a week, so we sort of knew when she came back, it was, everything hits the fan. You know how that is. And if anybody come back from vacation, looked at their desk and said, oh my goodness, all the problems that can happen. Well, the truth is she could have handled it, I think. She could have handled it. Except she had a friend that was talking in her ear. They were in the same office, and this was an older friend that should have known better. And she kept telling her stuff. Inciting. Inciting. Does anybody know what inciting is? Yeah. You incite violence, or you incite anger or fear in others. And you don't always have the truth going for you. You've got an agenda. There's an agenda going on, and that's what you need to look at. If you've got someone trying to incite in you, urging you or encouraging you to think or act a certain way, look at their agenda and see how much truth is in it. Well, anyway, the young woman jumped up, ran into the president's office, and proceeded to just tell him off. Well, what do you think happened? She lost her job. She's out of there. And made a few threats on the way, too. And at that time, I was the vice president of administration, so I had responsibility for all that. And wasn't long after that, there was a bullet hole in my office window about where my head was. Not a good feeling, is it? Not a good feeling at all. But back to what I was saying. I knew that it was my responsibility. So I wasn't thinking at that time of these three gates, but I was thinking especially about integrity and working with integrity. It was always very important to me. So I went to the woman's office that had been inciting all this unhappiness in her younger friend, and I just spoke quite honestly with her. I didn't say anything unkind, didn't say it in a mean tone of voice. I just said, I know what happened, and I know that you were telling her a lot of things, and many things weren't even true. Now, I hope you've learned a lesson here. You just got your young friend fired. And that's on your shoulders. And it was truth, right? It was truth. I did it with as much kindness as possible. Now, I've had people tell me that sometimes I say something so softly you might think you were just hugged instead of told off. And so there's that point too. When we're talking about kindness, we're not necessarily talking about being so soft-spoken that you can't get your point across. I read about another woman that was she was being a basketball coach in the junior league, and were with the little kids, and she was not being very successful at it at all. Her son finally came to her. He said, "Mom, listen. When you tell somebody they're out of bounds, you don't go up to them and apologize and say, 'I'm sorry, honey, but I think you stepped over the line.' Mom, you've got to actually be the line judge here. You've got to do it." So there's that aspect of it too, okay? Being so kind that you can't say the truth, or you can't get the nerve up to say it. And for a lot of you, I know that you can't even imagine that. But for a lot of us, it's very difficult to say something that you know might hurt someone. Extremely difficult. Extremely. So, all faiths use a similar adage to the one that we've given credit to Rumi for. Is it truthful? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Correct speech, whether it originated from Socrates, Buddha, the Hindus, Rumi, any other scholar, really, maybe the psalmist who said so poignantly, "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing." That beautiful. And from the book of James in the Christian scriptures, they talk about the tongue being like fire. And we know that can be the case too. I was reading about a fire that had happened in Wisconsin back in the 1800s, and at that time it was one of the worst that had ever occurred. And it covered acres and acres and acres, destroyed homes and forests. And they believe it may have just been started by a single spark from a passing train. You imagine? Our tongues are like that, you know. Another man said he's really taken himself to task because he realized he said a lot of things that when he really thought about it, he didn't know if they were true. He had just said them so many times, so many stories, he had convinced himself that they were. He said he was telling another young group of people about when he was a kid and how they might induct someone into this particular group and maybe stick a head in a toilet or something. And somebody said, "Is that really true?" Took him to task for it. He said, "Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know if it is or not." When he really thought about it, he could not remember an incident that was factual that he knew where this had actually occurred. He couldn't recall. So he took himself to task and he said, "You know what? I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to do that anymore." So if we will just remember to look at the words we're going to say, and is there truth in it? Are those rumors? Maybe something someone else said and I'm just repeating it. If you're in casual conversation, make sure that you state that. Because the next thing that's going to happen, the next person will repeat it and it's going to be bigger. They'll say, "Oh, Fred told me that." He always tells me true stories. Always. Necessity. Oh my goodness. What was that I read a few minutes ago? I have learned silence from the talkative. Amen. I almost don't need to say anything, do I? The funniest example. There was another place, no, that actually wasn't my office. It was a place where my husband was, and it was a small office. And I went in to one afternoon, and it was a startup company, IT company, and they were doing consulting work. And they had an office in, I believe it was in Chicago or someplace like that. And there was a man that was in a remote office there, and I guess he didn't have much company, and he talked a lot anyway. And I remember the woman on the telephone that she's holding the phone out like this, and you know who's on the other line. No one has to tell you. When she finally gets off the phone, she says, "You know what? I just feel like telling him, listen, I need to lay down. You have worn me out. I need to lay down and take a nap right now." Now, here's what I want to talk to you about too. Conversation can be exhausting, physically and spiritually. And we know that, and we're knowing it more and more and more, that we're coming back together in a physical setting. And we're understanding that sometimes, and sometimes these aren't discussions or conversations. Sometimes it's one person talking, isn't it? And you can't get a word in edgewise, as my mother used to say. And so that is exhausting. And you know what? That's not spiritual either. The spiritual thing is for us to know. If we're giving advice someone else doesn't want to hear, has the other person asked for advice from me? Am I an advice giver? And no one's ever asked me for advice. What makes me think that I know the ultimate answer? Maybe I'm more intelligent than they. Maybe that's the answer to it. But just like our verbose and windy friend that was on the phone, exhausting everyone, and he was worse in public. I know that because I was with him a lot. But exhausting. We need to find a kind and gentle way, don't we? Because there is a necessity, okay? There's a necessity there. We need to find a way to kindly say, I've heard enough. Or it's like the old country preacher. I heard him speak many, many years ago, as a matter of fact, in a country Methodist church, and he was just visiting, and he was talking about the freedom of speech and when to know when we've said enough, or maybe we need to speak up. See, that's the other side. Sometimes you need to speak up and you haven't. But he said, maybe God's called you to welcome visitors into the church. Maybe God's called you to work with the custodian to help clean the building. Maybe God's called you to teach a class or lead the music. But if you're just sitting there complaining, maybe God's called you to shut up. I've always remembered that. I've always remembered that. Now remember, I grew up in a time, and a lot of you may have, where the worries of the world were something you just took on your shoulders and took for granted, and there were a whole lot of negative Nellies out there now, all the time. And we didn't have a teaching like this one. We weren't actually taught the words that Jesus said. What I remember hearing as a child was words talking about what Jesus said, not Jesus' words. You're the light of the world. Go into your closet to pray. Leave the worries of the world out there, okay? Go into your closet. So I grew up hearing a lot of what religion taught and all those do's and don'ts that Jesus didn't actually say. But I didn't know there was a choice. So what I thought was, well, that's religion, and there's not anything else. It's either that or nothing. And so as an adult, when I came across a teaching like unity, I thought, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know you could be spiritual but not religious. Nobody had ever taught me that. I never heard it. I thought that you had to believe all the do's and don'ts, and that was it. There are different do's and don'ts now, and the wars have been fought over it. We know that. There have been separate countries created because of the do's and don'ts, right? But that's not what the great teachers said. All of them, from all of the great traditions, all around the world. They said, go to your heart and listen. And many of the New Thought teachers now, Byron Katie is one of them, talks about truth, loving what is, letting go of worry, be impeccable with your word. Anybody read that book by Ruiz? Yes, be impeccable with your word, saying exactly what I'm talking about right here today. May my words pass through the gates of truth, kindness, and necessity. Are they necessary? Are they necessary? And in the book of James, they talked about the tongue is like a spark in the fire. Words hurt. Words hurt. And every sincere seeker knows that when we're not speaking the truth, and that applies to half-truths. Anybody ever exaggerated a situation? Never. Have you ever exaggerated it so many times that it became your truth? I would just say that we look at that. There's no need for exaggeration. Silence is golden. Speak as little as possible. Open your lips only when necessary. Don't hurt others unnecessarily. Speak your words with love and kindness. And don't exhaust others with your verbosity. If you've got that much talking to do that you're going to exhaust everyone around you, go out and talk to the birds. Go out and walk by the ocean and talk to the ocean and the fish. But be aware. Be aware if you're using your words when you shouldn't. Be aware, too, with your body language, because a lot of times the body language is speaking, isn't it? Jesus said, we are the light of the world. How in the world are we ever going to see the world improve if we don't start speaking our own truth and spreading our light wherever we go? I thank you for being here and putting up with my verbosity. Have a good week.